Annet, may I ask you to join us at the podium for a final round of a small debate. Annet, you've been listening to Charles, who has constantly been referring to your talk, so you must have been making a great impression on him. May I ask you to do the same? And perhaps, is there anything you'd like to say on, nice talk, but how do you do that in real life, or this doesn't going to work, or would you like to challenge Charles a little bit on what he said?
It's always very, if you being from the blunt Dutch background, listening to this fantastic English.
You're going to say something rude
story.
now, aren't you? Story.
It's always
story.
There was one thing, we have this big elephant in the room which wasn't actually addressed. The fact is that as a regulator, you're actually executing regulations. You're not making them. And there's stuff, of course, you can do, how you execute it and how you do it. But at the end of the day, you're very much dependent on the regulations which are made by politicians. So how would you take on that challenge?
Well, the first thing to note is that kind of movement, which is, I see the possibility and it's great and I'd love to do it, but actually it's their problem. And until they do something, we can't do anything. If you wait for politicians, you'll wait forever, basically. I mean, I don't think there's any political leadership, really, that would be capable of... The place where you might find is at cities, I think. So what Bloomberg has done in New York is really interesting. Bloomberg had the self-confidence to take on very, very big vested interests. So he did over sugar, for instance. So you might find it there, but I wouldn't wait for them. I would say one of the reasons why you have to cede consumer power and frustration is you need to create the environment which pushes the politicians to start doing things. Because do you see what I mean? Because if you wait for them, you'll wait for a long time. And I honestly think that, you have nowadays, politics is all out there. It's not just in Parliament and all the rest of it. It's about influencing public opinion. It's happening the whole time. And actually consumer movements can emerge really rapidly around particular issues. So I wouldn't rely on them.
Thank you. You've been referring to Annette's talk many times. Is there anything in particular you'd like to address, you'd like to ask her now if you have the opportunity?
Well, the thing, actually, you know what? You lost me on slide 1. No, you did. Because the thing that I wanted to ask you was whether you think the notion of a value chain is still a good idea. Because I think there are value chains, but actually quite a lot of these places, they resemble a bowl of spaghetti to me, where it's not a chain at all. It's sort of everything's getting rather confused. And the whole notion of an orderly chain and people controlling bits of it, I don't think that works, really.
I think the chain was the opening bit, and hopefully in the end it became clear that...
you were really talking about ecosystems
the
much more of the time.
chain imploded, and it's really an ecosystem with changing fields. And
so what kind of metaphor, if the value chain metaphor doesn't work, what do you think would be a good metaphor? And is it the same for all those companies, or are they different?
I would, the obvious answer would be it has all become networks, but it's a bit of a platitude. So I'm just trying to think whether there's a better word to describe it. I haven't really come up with it, to be honest. Do you have any inspiration?
No, I think that they are sort of like managed commons, aren't they? Where you're paying them a fee to sort of manage some sort of semi-public space for you. But as a result, they also control what you do. They're sort of more like landlords in some kind of way, it seems. I sort of experience this as a sort of, whether it's radical freedom or it's some sort of cyber yoke, that we are like indentured serfs, and every time we click... Do you see what I mean? I'm never quite sure what I am, whether I'm sort of doing this for Google, because every click I do gives them more value, or whether it's that sort of dilemma, I suppose.
No, it's I would very much tend to agree. It's the whole. It's the whole dilemma you get into if certain services become so much part of a public good, and they're done by private initiative. How are you going to handle that? And you get in these very interesting debates, in the United States when they broke up AT&T and Little Bells, and why could you do that? And was it the right thing to do? Are we getting in the same type of questions here? It's this whole dilemma between public goods and private ownership, which we haven't really figured out.
Yeah.
Annet, you put up a lot of questions on the board. One of the most fascinating ones, I think, you talked about the over-the-top players, you talked about the global champions, and the relationship to competition, merger control. What do national competition agencies do? How on earth can they influence properly the balance of power? Do you have any ideas on the future of that part of our work?
It's what you see is that many of the competition authorities retreat to the safe field. So they put a lot of attention to relatively small mergers, which actually don't really matter that much, because the real threat is not coming from within that sector, but really from above or below the sector, or what is a sector, coming back to the value chain. And so looking at mergers and threats, maybe you should start looking at different currencies, in the sense not so much market definitions, market shares, those kind of things, but as I said, much more from the point of the view of the importance to the consumer. If you merge this, how much time of the consumer will be dominated by this firm, or how much of the money he spends, or how much of the data. So maybe you should just look at a different currency than from what you're doing now.
Change perspective. And I think the word perspective is something you often use, Charles. And you've pointed us to taking a different perspective to the same kind of problem, and the problem either disappears or becomes more complex. Now, we take usually a very legalistic, a very economic, a very technocratic look at issues. If you want to change perspective, maybe you need other people. Can you say something about the type of staff you would need in future? Do we need behavioralists? Do we need, what kind, if we would need to hire 20 extra people, how would you sort of divide their competencies?
I think you could hire them from some of the sectors that you're looking at, and perhaps from some of the kind of emergent bits of those sectors, for instance. Broadly speaking, what I say to people is that you need to be able to both get right above things, and by right above things, I think look at things at a sort of population level. So I think there is a lot of stuff out of big data now, and quantified analysis and Nate Silver and all the rest of it. So I do think that there's stuff that you could do there. I think you need to get really down, and I would also hire ethnographers who can tell you about what life is like for the people using this, and what they're trying to achieve and connect, because I think that yields enormous insight when that's done well. And I would look laterally, and I would hire people who face similar challenges to your own, but in slightly adjacent fields, who will come at this from a different point of view. So I'm really struck by the number of public challenges now, which look like public health challenges. They look more like the framework of public health. How do we prevent certain things spreading, or how do we encourage other kinds of things to spread? And I think you have to be good at understanding. You have to be good at understanding out there, not just understanding the people you're directly dealing with and regulating. So you have to have people who are very sort of outward looking. The challenge that you're facing is the same challenge as all the organisations that you're regulating, and many public organisations. We have these responsibilities. People expect us to do a good job. But at the same time, we've got to try and develop and learn about the new kind of world and take our steps into it. And the only way to do that, as Queen Maxima said, is to take the plunge. You do not learn how to swim on the side of the pool. And the problem with the public sector is it sees a swimming pool and then it says, oh, wait a minute, we'll just test how deep the water is, and then we'll kind of survey kind of how kind of big the pool is, and we'll wait till other people get in, and so on and so forth. You need to learn how to kind of get in the water and start swimming whilst taking, as Bill said, taking risks, which means probably doing it with a float and a lifeguard. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah, I do. You're not looking for a job yourself at this point in time?
Well, I think it's really good. I mean, I remember when Brian Carlsberg started Oftel, and the job of regulation was to set an RPI minus X formula. So, you know, it's inevitable that your kinds of jobs have become massively more complicated, demanding and exciting. But I think in a way, you have to sort of try and bring in some of the spirit of the people who are trying to change the industry and get it working for you as well, I would say.
One final point before I open up for questions. The word big data is a buzzword, of course, and we're only starting to think of it and what it could mean for us as supervisory authorities. I know the CMA has been thinking about it, other authorities do. Can you give a first reflection on how that could help agencies like us, either Annet or yourself? Because it's in the air somewhere, and what should we do with that?
I mean, the danger around big data is, you know, everyone talks about it, and I know quite a few companies who are hiring big data analysts. But the big data in themselves are nothing. They're just a heap of bits. So it's really around, you know, what do you do with them? And so it starts actually with the questions you want to have answered. And then with the, you know, the algorithms and what you get out of those data. And so we're much too much focused on the data and not on, you know, what do you do with the data and why do you want to have them. So for me, it's very important before you jump on the big data that you take the step back and you start thinking, you know, why do these big data matter and what can they change and what can I do differently and when I have these big data and I could get out of them anything I wanted. And so you have to think at the other end. Start thinking at the other end.
You say that because there are people that say the opposite. You should start with analyzing and see what kind of patterns there are.
But then, you know, you get so much patterns which, you know, people think are causal and then turn out to be correlations. You get lots of fake patterns. Nassim Taleb, who wrote The Black Swan, is one of the biggest enemies of big data. He is a fantastic diatribe against them. It would be worthwhile to listen to that.
Charles, you were nodding affirmatively?
Yeah. I think big data is a way for IT companies to sell us more service, basically.
Okay, that's a good answer.
I mean, but I think there is something really interesting in it, but I think only when you combine it with open data. And the people that I know that use it really well, Transport for London has become a big and open data provider because it's then generated a huge number of apps to allow people to use public transport in new kinds of ways and make better consumer choices. But it's not just through big data, but it's the combination of big, open and usable data. And so as a result, that's had a big impact now. You can get all sorts of apps to help you use bus services and link them to other things and so on and so forth that's been generated out of that. So I would encourage you to think that you might have a way of doing big data which is open. What would it be like for a regulator to do a more open data version of that rather than thinking that you're going to do all of it? How could you seed other people with that data so they could start doing a better job with it on behalf of consumers as well? Be one question.
Thank you, Charles. Ladies and gentlemen, the floor is open for questions, comments, suggestions. My colleague from Romania, please, Bogdan. Wait for the microphone, please. Please. And we've changed our technique a little bit. We will hold the microphone ourselves.
Now, I'll try to be short because you had a very interesting presentation, but I'll just try to be the devil's advocate. So you're very convincing to me, saying there's a lot of change. It's pretty unpredictable. I can understand why this is bad or challenging for business people, but as a competition authority, I might tend to agree to say that maybe it's how it should be. If these companies, it's not very clear if the dominant companies in the world are going to be there 2 years from now on, why should I worry? Maybe that's a recipe for me doing little and letting the markets work and trying not to get in their way.
A suggestion to do away with competition authorities by a competition authority.
Trepidation.
No, but
Risk-taking.
Risky idea.
Annette, will you?
yeah, I think the issue is not so much about disruption and companies who cannot react to it quickly enough or are too protectionist, afraid of cannibalization disappearing. My worry is more that what comes instead, if you're not careful, you get it very much into, you don't get a nice new competitive landscape instead, but you get a landscape which is much more dominated by winner takes all patterns, and by patterns which are very much where people are becoming very, very dependent on the services. So it's, and then on the other hand, but that's maybe a bit less theoretical, if you see, big companies coming, investing a lot of money and then disappearing from one day to the other, it does get a destruction of value and capital if the world gets too volatile. So if you have all these factories built up and then they go bankrupt and they disappear because of companies not being able to react quickly enough, it seems to be, it's on the one hand a normal, it's always been like this, but it seems to be speeding up and actually might lead to a lot of waste. So, but I think the first argument is the more important one.
Charles, any addition?
No, I only to completely reinforce it, I don't trust Facebook, Apple, Google, or any of them. I think they are creating important public goods. I think they're creating great products. But I also think Steve Jobs has all our credit card numbers, or his successors do, and they are determined to use them. So, and I don't think they're very keen on sharing that with new entrants. And so I think if you think the potential of this technology is not yet exploited, we're just at the start, and there are all sorts of different ways in which it goes. And if a very small group of people, in effect, who kind of come from a particular place in the world, are going to decide how that's exploited, I don't think that's going to make the best use of it. I mean, how we decided that it was a good idea to hand all our social interactions over to a group of savants and autistic people from Silicon Valley, they're really good at kind of the social, aren't they? I just don't think that that's going to be true. So we've got to find a way to keep that dynamism going. I mean, the only kind of saving grace is that sort of reading that list of acquisitions on Wikipedia is that you could also put up Microsofts and you could also put up Nokias. And there's no guarantee that having made those acquisitions that they're going to be successful.
Thank you. I saw Mrs. Yvonne van Rooij.
Ja, natuurlijk. Heel handig, very handy. I'm a chairperson of the Netherlands Association of Hospitals, but I'm also a member of the supervisory board of a bank. And it's on the latter that I would like to ask you a question, both of you. It's on big data and it's on the disruptive technologies. Now, one of the Dutch banks recently mentioned that big data could be interesting for a new business model. Everybody fell over this bank because that was affecting the privacy of all the account holders. At the same time, we saw, Annette, in your presentation, Google entering payment services. It's what Alibaba is doing already. Now, in the past few years, after the financial crisis, we have overburdened, I think, the financial sector with regulations, with oversight, supervision, you may name it, and it's very difficult, I guess, to make a new or to develop new business models. Now, at the same time, you see that these powerful big internet companies are via the back door entering the financial markets. And one day we see that payment services are no longer done via the Rabobank or another bank, but via Alibaba or Google. And what is the role of supervisors to help financial systems to develop new business models and to prevent that also this financial sector is moving in the hands of the big American companies?
Great question. Help the banks. Annet.
Yeah, I want to be careful. We shouldn't kind of now make it into a session of bashing the big internet companies. They've done fantastic things, and what they've done also to the development of society. So it's about finding the right balance, and I think we're trying to find it. They're trying to find it in their way. So. And we're not there yet. It's gone so quickly. We've been so overwhelmed, and they themselves too, that we're kind of looking at it and don't really know how to handle it yet, just to put it in context. Coming back to your point, I think that I'm in the board of a big insurance company here in the Netherlands, so I can really share your sentiment about how difficult it is to innovate in a context of a very, very strict regulatory framework, which, by the way, the sector kind of has to blame on itself. But and what you see is that this whole payment area is actually seen as the next area of growth. Also by Facebook, thinking about how can you monetize WhatsApp. It's done by many of the telco companies. It's not only Vodafone, but also Telenor in Asia playing a big role there. So a lot of competition. And why is this? Is because this whole sector is completely inefficient. It's very expensive. It's many, many things. And just remember what Maxima was saying this morning, rightfully so. So what can you do to at least not hinder the banks and the insurance company to reinvent themselves? Whether they do it is the second question, to be honest. I think that, especially the financial authorities should really kind of take a step back, and they're very in an anxious mode at the moment, and rather, take het zekere voor het onzekere, as we would say in Holland, rather than think, what is the real essential, what have been the real pain points that made this thing out of control, and let's focus on those and let the others free. So they have to reassess the way they regulate, rather than just take the blanket approach, would be my...
We have representatives of the financial authorities, but I will not challenge them at the moment, unless they want to. Charles, any addition, perhaps?
Well, only that I don't think the future is in more regulation for the financial sector. I do think it's more competition, and not just competition to shift an account from one current account to another that's exactly the same, but competition to bring in entirely new models. That industry, in the UK at least, deserves, it's so dysfunctional, it has taken its consumers for granted for so long that it needs really real competition and new and different models. And my worry would be that the control over the payment system in the UK is that if you're a new entrant and you want to get into the clearing system to use it, it's locked up by the 4 big banks. So actually you need to open up that market. So if you were to paint a future for me that said, imagine a financial system where we had an operating system, a combined payment system run by someone like Google, but actually there were a myriad of different new entrants coming in with genuinely new models, that would be really exciting. A bit like the energy market, where you've got a kind of central infrastructure that's publicly regulated, but lots of competitors coming in. That, I think, is great. A kind of protecting the incumbent banks, who are... No, I know that. No, I know that's true. And but in you can tell in most of the big organisations that I go to are in a state of civil war, basically. And they're a state of civil war for 2 reasons. One is there's a bunch of people saying, this is our business, we know how to do it, but it may be going down, but it's our business. And other people saying, no, but there's this other business over here, and we don't know how to do it, but it's the future. And then there are a bunch of people in banks saying, look, we know how to make money, and okay, it's not very good, but at least we know how to make money. And some other people saying, no, we've got to be proud of what we do and ethical and so on and so forth. And you find that that's why running these organizations is such a challenge, to kind of, to deal with these very, very big dilemmas and stresses and strains.
Thank you. Interesting you say that about entry to the banking world. We have issued an opinion on that and an advice last week, so we advise you all to read that, everybody in this room. I saw a question from Mr. Knibbeler. Wait for the mic, please.
Thanks very much. Winfred Knibbeler, Freshfields. I'm taking the perspective of a traditional antitrust practitioner. Building on the last question, and regardless of the sector, I think that question illustrates the dilemma which ACM in fact is facing by combining being the consumer regulator and a traditional competition regulator. And that really is a dilemma, an institutional dilemma from my perspective, which the authority is facing, because consumer regulation is something of a completely different nature than competition enforcement, and there's often a temptation to find short-term solutions from a competition protection perspective, which in the end do not help innovation and maybe a barrier to entry. My question to the panelists, I enjoyed your presentation. How do you look at this tension, this institutional tension between combining consumer regulation and competition enforcement? And also referring back to one of the observations of Professor Sunstein this morning, one thing to avoid is probably for government to pick a winner. There's a host of academic literature and research where it's recommended not to try to pick winners as a regulator or as a government. I got the feeling that maybe what you are advocating this afternoon, also from that perspective, I'd like to have an answer. By the way, I was not intending to answer all the questions of Professor Aris of this afternoon. We are in the habit, being competition practitioners, to get at this time on Friday a large number of questions by competition authorities, but that's because then the clock is stopped in cases where the clock can be stopped if you raise further questions. And the clock is hopefully not stopped today. Thanks.
I thought lawyers were having a drink by this time on Friday, but that is... Charles, will you pick it up first, please?
Yeah. Lawyers are on the golf course on Friday, aren't they? I don't know enough about this competition consumer thing to be able to talk about it. The only thing that I would say is that the two things I think are becoming inextricably linked, because if the relationship that these companies have with their consumers is a different kind of relationship, I think. They're deeply entangled, and that's what's going to help create the potential lock-in effects. But as far as Cass's point about don't pick winners, actually, I think he said don't pick winners and losers or something like that. I think you can definitely pick losers. I think you can definitely say to society, we want to get rid of that. Sugar in fizzy drinks is a big loser. There's absolutely no doubt about it. And we should be able to stand up and say that shouldn't happen. Women being abused on Twitter for simply being women, that's a loser. We should definitely stand up. The use of the internet to organise child pornography and exploitation, that's a loser. We should definitely stand up for it. So I think there are definitely losers that we can stand up for and we can say. The bigger question is, how do you, as a government, try and assemble a sense of this might be a good direction to head in and to explore in, if not picking winners, certainly to encourage that exploration. And say, as far as health systems go, I don't think government can just sort of wash its hands of that. I don't think it can say, well, let's just see what the market might throw up, because the market may not be a very good way to explore that. So, how many of those companies, and particularly Google, but how many of those companies in the entire internet rests on public investment of some kind or another in the United States? Quite a lot of it, actually. So I don't think, all the most innovative countries that I go to recognise that innovation is a public-private partnership, and that the public component of it remains really, really important, I think.
Annette, any comment?
Yeah, I think the dilemma between, on the one hand, competition regulation on the consumer, I don't think that is the dilemma. The dilemma is much more short-term versus long-term regulation. And if you really focus too much on the short-term, and this rule, we really should have these free parties, and they should all, and therefore we don't get innovation. But then on the other hand, if you let it go the other way too much, you don't get innovation either. So this whole dilemma, I think it's more a question in how do you balance the short term versus the long term than how do you balance the consumer versus the competition regulation. And I think the debate should be much more around that than around the consumer perspective and the competition perspective, because at the end, they should be the same.
I saw Bill. Microphone for Bill, although normally he doesn't need one.
Bring my vertical integration. Two terrific talks. This reminds me of why I wanted to be an academic in the first place, to be here today. Let me make a pitch first for why that name is exactly right. Everything Charlie mentioned in his last comment requires the ability to knock heads together. Power. That's authority. If you don't have that as a public institution, you're just another babbler outside telling people what to do. So authority, indispensable to do the hard things. Consumers, I think we agree we need them. Markets. Here's a subtle contribution that I think competition agencies have made over time. A good deal of what they do is to tell public institutions to get out of the way of exactly the kind of people you're mentioning, or tell private actors to get out of the way of the emergence of new models, essentially protecting precisely the margins you mattered. The container example you mentioned in the US doesn't happen if the Department of Justice isn't involved in trying to loosen restrictions in the domestic US market for the development of that approach. In area after area, you have competition agencies doing that. Now, they don't know who these people are at the margins, but they know that public and private restrictions that keep them from emerging are real impediments. So I keep markets on my list. A question about entrepreneurship that's hard for the new agency. I'm a new tech guy and I've got an app. It's a really interesting idea, and like so many ideas, my idea is coming laterally. It is a complement that could turn into a substitute. It could transform the market. Here comes, let's just say, big giant company, okay, from North America, okay, from the United States, comes to me and says, we'll give you a basket of money for your idea. We want to buy it from you. There's the chance that my idea could be transformative, disruptive in the sense that Charlie's framework suggested. It's going to upset the entire framework that Annette had on her slides. All those people are going, my name's going to be up there at some point if we do that. But I have a tiny presence. Do you let big, giant incumbent, who might not even be doing what I'm doing, buy me? Or do you prohibit that transaction because left to my own, I might go ahead and do it? And mind you, one of the reasons that I started doing this is that I saw the money to be made out there. And there's someone else who might start thinking their own company because they're hoping to be bought out someday. Competition agency, I have hardly any sales, but I have a great new idea. Do you let big, giant company buy me, or do you say that's prohibited?
Yeah, that's exactly.
Charles first? Great question.
That is a great question. So let me answer the first bit of it first. So just to be clear, I wasn't saying get rid of authority, markets and consumers, but having put that in your title, you're going to need to think very hard about what authority is. Because if you think authority is experts telling people what the answer is, that isn't going to work. Because actually authority rests in all sorts of different ways. So you're going to need to earn, show, assemble your authority, and you're going to show that markets is not just some sort of fiction of kind of rational equilibrium and all the rest of it. So it's not to say don't use it, but and absolutely a lot of those things require authority. Should you prevent that kind of transaction? I think that's really hard. I mean, I think it's very, very hard to stand in and say to an entrepreneur, no, you can't sell that to Google and kind of make that process. I mean, I think it's very, very hard indeed. So I would, because I think you'd have to bet that there's someone else going to come along as well after that, I think. So I would, the idea that we could stand there and say, definitely, we know what the best route is. But what I do think is that we do, as a society, have a responsibility to make sure that there are alternatives to Google. So there are alternative sources of funding, alternative routes to market, and particularly that there are public alternatives to private alternatives. So if Google is the only book thing and there's no public thing, then so what we've got to do is create a diversity of ways to success, and that the thing that really worries me is that everyone thinks the only route to success is via Silicon Valley. And if that is true, then that's a real problem. We've got to create a greater diversity of ways to success. And actually, I was involved in a discussion yesterday. We've actually got to also, I think, create a diversity of notions of what success is. Because if success is just $1 billion exit, then we're screwed, basically, because there are only two places in the world where you're going to get that, China and America, I think. And we've got to think of success in some different way, I think, as well, which is more social in its purpose, probably.
Annet, any addition? And then Henk?
Yeah, I would agree with all of it. I think I always like stories. There's this really nice new television series called Silicon Valley by HBO. And it's about this little startup which really finds this great compression algorithm, and then the guy who leads it has to choose by getting 10 million from a Google-like company or keep continuing itself. And it's very interesting if you see how the storytellers portray the dilemma and why he in the end then decides to go for himself, if only it's better for the television series. But still, what it does is, an entrepreneur by definition doesn't want to be told what to do, because that's why he's an entrepreneur. So kind of putting in rules and say, well, you can't do that or you can't sell yourself is, people wouldn't want to be entrepreneurs anymore. So it would be killing your entrepreneurialism. So what you can do, and I fully agree with that, you have to create pull mechanisms for people to make it so attractive that they don't sell out. And that has to do with the availability of funds. It has to do with support of infrastructure. It has to do with status. You're the independent entrepreneur and not an employee. So there's a lot of things. I think it is a very serious issue, but you should really orchestrate the environment so it becomes more attractive for entrepreneurs to stay entrepreneur. And the other thing, just coming back to your point, the interesting thing I just said about the mobile apps in Europe, the fact that the mobile apps which are so successful are actually the apps which earn money, as opposed to the mobile apps from the Silicon Valley which don't earn money, because they all get the venture capital money. So having a lot of venture capital money is not always the best definition to build a great business. A bit of restraint sometimes is also good.
So in Spain, social sharing apps are growing because they're being bootstrapped, whereas Whipcar collapsed in London because it was venture capital. It's a different way to grow a business.
Henk Don?
Following on this diversity issue that you'd like to promote, if I understand correctly, I wonder why don't you mention changes in patent law or intellectual property? That could mean a game changer in how this market works.
Yes, I haven't mentioned it simply because it wasn't. I mean, it's something that I've written about and thought about. But patent law, for me, is now widely abused by large companies to create thickets, to deter new entrants, and it's a kind of widespread perversion of its original intention to be a way to allow people to publicize their innovations and so on and so forth. And it's absolutely clear to me that I think that most of the most interesting models of the future involve elements of sharing and elements of making money, and that you have to try and work with both, and that Creative Commons type kind of patent and copyright kind of innovation in that kind of way is an important part of the future, because you want to kind of exploit the shareability, which leads to scale, distribution, low cost, but you've also got to find some way of rewarding content creators and people who put up the risk, because this Albarese book, the Blockbuster book, is in essence, if you're down in the long tail, you're poorer than you ever were, basically, is kind of. And whilst people are, so East London, which is kind of, the sort of epicenter of the hippest bit of London, it's basically full of people who can't make money, and they sort of live their lives. Do you know what I mean? It's a sort of collapse of the creative class. Richard Florida came along and said the creative class is the future. It turns out that he arrived just at the moment where the creative class had the rug pulled out from underneath it, in a way. So we need to do something about that. And again, then, I mean, it's a very, I find it deeply, deeply perplexing, I have to say, because I see no evidence at all that there are fewer people who want to make music or consume music. I don't think music is in crisis. I think the recording industry is in crisis, and I think very few people are making money. But actually, music is flourishing. That's the sort of dilemma. How long can it really flourish for? And one of the big challenges in that is, how do you fund real innovation? because you can get lots of sort of incremental kind of collaborative innovation of a kind, but how do you fund people who are going to really write new things or create really big things or difficult things if they need time and money to do that?
I saw one gentleman in the back, and then I would like to go to the last question. So please think of that. I saw the gentleman in the back.
To follow on from what you said there about patents, so would you consider what Elon Musk just did with Tesla's patents as a good example of opening up and encouraging innovation within a particular market? Or
I don't know enough about what he's done, but I think that all of the most effective models in this space now involve some element of sharing, openness and closure in some measure, because you need sharing and openness to amplify reach and get more diversity, and so you get Apple opening up its systems so lots of people can create stuff, and then some element of closure, which is this is where we take the money, basically. I mean, it's a gate in effect. So I think that that's why these models create such a dilemma, because the sharing is all about all these words we love: sharing, open, collaborative, so on and so forth. But actually, on the basis they can be used with network effects to create extremely powerful lock-in positions for the people who control the gate.
Now, ladies and gentlemen, you have a great opportunity to make an everlasting impression, to put the final question at this conference and leave us in total confusion. Anybody from business, from government, from politics? Here's your expert panel. Anybody? Usually within ACM, I then go to somebody and ask him what he wants to ask, but I don't do this at this occasion. So if not, a great round of applause, please, for our two speakers. Thank you very much.